Spin-offs in a large franchise can go one of two ways. They can be useless garbage made to profit off of the name of the series. Pointless games that parade as a new direction, but really are just there to rake in some extra dough. Or they can be an opportunity, a new avenue for the developers to try something new within the bounds of what they've already created. And the latter is the case with the game we'll be talking about today, Judgment. Judgment is a spin-off of the Yakuza series. It's still set in Kamurocho. It uses similar battle systems to the games that we've been talking about. It still plays and feels quite a lot like a Yakuza game. But it's the subtle differences, interesting new systems, and themes that set Judgment apart from the mainline series. Imagine a detective story set inside the Yakuza world. It excels not only as a detective game, but as a Yakuza game. It's fresh, it's fun, and it's exciting. It doesn't stray too far from the path, but takes its little journeys outside of the trodden road to try and change things for the better. Today, I'll be taking an in-depth look at Judgment, talking about story, gameplay, mechanics, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous videos on the Yakuza series, I would recommend going and checking them out now to get a sense of how the series got to where it is in this video, but it isn't 100% necessary. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by subscribing to my Patreon, where I upload text updates and longer versions of my full retrospectives. If you'd like to support the channel for free, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps me out. You can also follow me on Twitch, where I stream other games that I'm not reviewing here. Spoiler alert for everything Judgment. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Judgment. Yakuza producers and executives started talking about the idea for a new IP after the release of Yakuza 5. They wanted to create a new IP because they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket. Nagoshi decided to write a new story, a detective story, in contrast to his work on the Yakuza series. Development officially started in 2015, and the game was hinted at by Nagoshi in 2018 when he said they would be announcing something completely different. The game was originally announced as Project Judge. It was developed again using the Dragon engine. The team put an emphasis on lighting in this entry to shine a spotlight on the theme of legal suspense. They introduced a completely new main character in that of Yagami, and wanted to stay away from having cameos from Yakuza characters to make the game truly its own series. Judgment's characters were made to be distinct from Yakuza. They didn't want to retread old ground, they wanted something fresh and new. The Judgment series as a whole was meant to run parallel to the Yakuza series. As the new games are venturing into the JRPG arena, the Judgment games would be a series for fans of the brawler system that Yakuza was known for. Judgment was given an English dub during the localization in the West. This was done in response to the success of Yakuza 0 in these areas. They didn't think that the dub would fit Yakuza 6, so they skipped that entry and decided to try it out on Judgment. Matt Mercer, Crispin Freeman, and Shirami Lei are just a few of the English actors that appear in the game. Judgment, or Judge Eyes in Japan, was released on December 13th, 2018 in Japan and June 25th, 2019 worldwide. A few notes before we get into things. The first is that Judgment came out before Yakuza 7, so it takes place in between Yakuza 6 and Yakuza 7. I wanted to catch up with the mainline series before talking about the spin-offs, which is why I talked about Yakuza 7 first. I also say this just in case some people are wondering why the Tojo are still around at this point. The second note is on the structure of this review. The Yakuza series are known for its plethora of side content and minigames to get lost in. I refer to these as distractions because they are easy to, well, get distracted by. Judgment is a different series technically, but it's still basically a Yakuza game, and includes a ton of side content to get lost in as well. Because of this, I'll first be talking about the story, gameplay, and all of the mechanics that go along with that, and then I'll venture back to talk about Judgment's distractions. The third note is on the version of Judgment that I played. Judgment was actually remastered for the PS5. Its visuals were upgraded, its frame rate and loading times were improved, and it's just an all-around better experience. No content was changed in the game, so it's not a drastically different experience outside of the visuals and performance. Also, I should note that this game contains the second of the Yakuza series' 2 drug use scandals. Just like Tanimura's actor was removed from the game for Yakuza 4 Remastered, Hamura's actor in Judgment was removed for a drug scandal as well. I'm not going to get too in-depth into this, just know Japan doesn't like drugs, and if you do them, you get removed from Yakuza games. The game starts in 2015. We're introduced to Takayuki Yagami, our main character and a lawyer. He works in the Genda law office with Masamichi Shintani. He just won a major case, declaring the client innocent. The office then gets a call letting them know that the same man, Shinpai Okubo, has just been accused of stabbing his girlfriend and setting their house on fire. Yagami's career is then over, a huge stain on his reputation, and Okubo is sentenced to death. We jump ahead 3 years to 2018, the present day in Judgment. Like I said, this game takes place between Yakuza 6 and 7, but that isn't incredibly important outside of the world itself. Yagami is on the street, seemingly homeless judging by his clothes and style. He's actually disguised though. He's working as a detective with a former Yakuza, Masaharu Kaito. He's tailing another detective who owes someone money. We're dragged into combat and Yagami reveals his true look. Yagami has to fight the detective and get the money for his client. Kaito and Yagami return to their office and we learn a bit more about the state of Kamurocho. There's some strange parkour men running around the city stealing from the rich, and a string of murders, bodies with their eyes gouged out, are connected to the Tojo. Yagami wants to go see his old boss Genda at his office, but Kaito wants him to buy some dorayaki for the office. Yagami goes out to get it and is accosted by some Yakuza from the Matsugane family. Hamura steps in, a captain of the family, and tells them that Yagami is off limits. He also reveals that their boss was the one that paid for his law school, and of course tells them about how his career fell. Apparently Kaito was kicked out of the Matsugane family, an ex-Yakuza. Before we get into things, we should talk about the big gameplay changes that Judgment makes to the series. We'll talk about combat in a bit, but that isn't the only area that Judgment is different in. Judgment introduces a ton of new gameplay elements that truly make this a detective game, outside of just playing as a detective. When we're tasked with following someone in the story, we'll go into a tailing section. We'll have to try and keep up with the target through the streets of Kamurocho without being noticed. If we do get noticed, a bar at the top of the screen will start to fill. We can stop this by taking cover or getting out of sight. We can't lose sight of the target though. If they're out of our vision for too long, we fail the mission. These can be really fun and challenging. It adds a whole new element, and as you'll see with a lot of these gameplay changes, they truly make it feel like a real detective game. They usually aren't too difficult though, and some of the AI can be real dumb. It's very easy to just take cover really quick and get out of sight. There's some upgrades we can get to increase the amount of time that the target can be out of our vision as well, which makes them infinitely easier. They are well designed though, and there were certain points where I lost a target around a corner, and when I caught up, I had just completely lost their path. I didn't know which road they had gone down, and I was totally lost. The other big part of Judgment are chases. We've seen this throughout most of the Yakuza series, but I really think they're done best in Judgment. These are high-paced action sequences where we have to catch up to a target. Our path is mostly fixed, allowing us to only move side to side. We have to complete quick-time actions to avoid items being thrown at us or avoid debris that's in our way. These are also generally pretty easy, and most of the time don't require that you actually catch up to the enemy, but just endure for long enough. They are admittedly pretty fun though, and add some quicker action to break up the detective activities. It's a good pacing that makes the game evenly balanced between looking for clues and fighting/chasing enemies. Another element that's introduced to Judgment are the active search modes. These are moments where Yagami has to deduce something from a person, look for clues, or find a specific individual. Here we go into first-person mode and have to examine different objects in the scene, trying to meet a list of requirements. This is great at putting us in the shoes of Yagami or a detective in general. It feels like we have some sort of sixth sense, some intuition, and the rumble of the controller as we pass over clues reflects this. There are a lot of other changes that Judgment makes to the classic Yakuza formula, but we'll get to those as we come to them. Yagami heads over to the Genda law office, meeting the new lawyer, Isai Hoshino. Genda tries to convince Yagami to become a lawyer again, but of course he refuses. Clearly the case all those years ago and that massive mistake have left a scar on him. Genda offers Yagami a divorce case, giving him some more detective work, but the office gets a call. It's Shintani. Hamura has been arrested for the Yakuza killings, and Shintani has been put on the case. Yagami heads over to the bar called Tender and meets him. Yagami used to work at Bartender back in the day before becoming a lawyer. Shintani and Yagami head over to talk to Hamura. He's flippant, but apparently had a fight with the third victim in the case, Toshiro Kume. It certainly doesn't look good for Hamura either, because he dragged him into a club and has a very thin alibi of being at a sauna. We head over to the sauna to see if anyone saw him, but no one knows Hamura's face. The next day, Yagami is given the footage showing Hamura dragging the victim into the club. He heads to the place to talk to the manager, who admits that Hamura really wasn't that rough with Kume. Yagami returns to the office and Kaito is talking to Mafuyu Fuji. Yagami is teased about Fuji being his girlfriend, but she explains that the prosecution is going to press charges against Hamura for the murder. She's heading out and Kaito tells Yagami to walk her home. They then run into Morita and Uzumida. Morita is the chief prosecutor and Izumida is Yagami's old rival. Tsukumo, a friend who basically lives at the internet cafe, contacts us and wants us to bring him a rare model from the store. This is all an introduction to the friend system that Judgment adds, but we'll talk about that in the distractions section. Kaito and Yagami talk to Shintani about the case at the Genda law office. The next day, Yagami heads to the Matsugane family office. Matsugane tells Yagami that the Kyodai family are located at a building called KJ Art, a front for their business. They've been stealing territory from the Matsugane family, and Yagami has an interest in them because the newest victim in the case, Kume, was a member of the Kyodai. There we meet Kaito and have to use the drone to find Murase, a lieutenant of the clan and our target. Flying the drone is often used to scope out a situation beforehand. It can also be used in exploration around the city to find some neat stuff. Its controls certainly take some getting used to, and it can be kind of finicky to fly. We have to get inside by breaking the AC and posing as a repairman. We're introduced to 3 new elements to Judgment's gameplay here, all pretty important. The first is that of a disguise. We can use disguises at certain points in the story or side cases to blend in as someone else and get information or clues. It's a pretty cool system, but can really only be used within the bounds of the story. If we try to equip a disguise outside of that, we aren't allowed. The other elements introduced here are those of intrusion. We lockpick doors now to get into blocked off areas or use wires to slip into places. Lockpicking can be pretty annoying in a lot of games, and it's a make or break system depending on how a game implements it, but I feel like Judgment does a pretty good job of it. We usually have a generous time limit that we have to play against here, and these challenges are never very difficult anyways. It feels like both systems work pretty well. Yagami tries to infiltrate the building posing as an AC repairman, but is eventually found out. He gets to Murase though, and we have our first boss battle. With that, we should probably go over the combat system in general, because it's quite different than most of the Yakuza battle systems we've seen previously. Like I said before, Judgment was meant to play parallel to Yakuza, or at least that's how it's seemed so far. Since the mainline games were turning to the JRPGs genre, Judgment would stay classic brawlers. Because of this, they generally play like the Yakuza games we know and love. We use square to do rush combos, triangle to do finishing blows, yada yada yada. There's technically no heat in this game. We now have an X gauge, which is just the same thing as the heat gauge with a different name. We can do X actions with triangle at the right moments. Yagami also has 2 styles of fighting, Crane and Tiger. Crane is more used for crowd control when facing multiple enemies at once. Its moves are a little more wide-sweeping and do slightly less damage. The Tiger stance is used for single target fights. It does a lot more damage and it's more narrow in its movements. One big new thing we can do with Yagami is wall attacks. We run into the walls around us and jump off of them, attacking as we push out. These can naturally lead into X actions as well. We can of course still use weapons from the street and do some wild stuff with them. The upgrade system is also pretty simple. We get SP by completing missions, defeating enemies, and finishing parts of our completion list. We use this SP to unlock new skills, level up our attacks, combo speed, health, or unlock things like Tiger Drop. Of course, the core of the Yakuza systems are still there, but how does it feel, and do the changes made feel fresh and new? Well, I think so. Overall, I think the fighting system in Judgment is really smooth. It can feel a little sluggish to start, but I feel like the upgrades that you make along the way genuinely feel like Yagami is progressing in power throughout the game. They're large upgrades that you can almost feel instantly. It's not a slow increase over time. You generally feel a big change by unlocking something or upgrading your attack. The fighting feels really good, and I feel like the X actions are some of the best the series has seen. Not necessarily in their execution, but in their ease of use. Yakuza has always had a problem with heat actions being wonky to use, sometimes not triggering when you want them to, but here it feels so easy to execute them. It's amazing. This is probably the entry so far that has done them the best. It's very easy to flow in and out of combat, into X actions, up onto the wall, punching a group of enemies, throwing one into others, into another X action. The whole thing just feels great. It's probably one of my favorite Yakuza combat systems so far, if I'm being honest. Another thing we're introduced to with this first boss fight is mortal wounds. When enemies use powerful attacks or deadly weapons during combat, we can get mortal wounds. This disables part of our health bar, causing us to not be able to use normal healing items to refill our health. We have to either use a medicine bag to heal that mortal wound, or go visit a doctor and have them heal us up. This is a great addition and really makes you fight more conservatively in combat. I think it also fits with the story. Yagami isn't one of these crazy legendary Yakuza types. Sure, he can definitely hold his own, but he's not battling the most powerful men alive like Kiryu and coming out without a scratch. Murase isn't very difficult, but it's a good fight. We're still learning the ropes here, so we aren't doing anything too crazy just yet, just starting to feel out this new system and how it works. Once Murase is down, he tells us that he was with Kume the night that he was killed. He left to try and get back up, but everyone was gone when he came back. He wouldn't testify because he believes Hamada really killed Kume. Yagami tells Shintani what happened and they visit Hamada. He's still being sketchy. Kaito tells Yagami about a dirty cop that might be able to help them named Ayabe. He isn't at his usual spot, tender, but Masuda tells them something interesting. He was going to give Yagami a job, but the client was punched by a Yakuza, Hamada himself. Since Hamada is behind bars, his services aren't in need anymore. We have to go find the host, Saya, but he stood up all of the dates he was supposed to have in town. We finally track him down and he agrees to testify that Hamada punched him, giving the Yakuza a good alibi for the murder. We find the place Hamada was, outside of a restaurant, and the camera that can prove his innocence. Murase arrives though, and Kaito shows up to help us out. We fight Murase again, this time he has a real sword, meaning our chance of mortal wounds is much higher. The next day at the trial, the video evidence of Hamada's alibi is presented, but Saya can't bring himself to testify. Apparently, Murase kidnapped his sister, blackmailing him out of testifying. We have to rescue the girl. Kaito distracts the guys outside of KJ Art, and we head in the back, blasting through crowds of enemies, lockpicking doors, and making our way to the top. We finally confront Murase, and Yagami tells him Hamada is innocent, proving it. Murase doesn't know who killed him, but Yagami thinks Hamada must be covering up for the real killer. Saya testifies and Hamada is proven innocent. Yagami decides to make it his duty to catch this killer, who he's just given a name, the Mole. Before he leaves the courtroom, he's confronted by Ko Hattori, a journalist, the one who ended Yagami's career, and it brings back all sorts of demons. The next day, Kaito and Yagami investigate the murder scene of the first victim, Mashiba. Yagami heads to the next murder site over on Tenkaichi Street. Yagami's phone is stolen by someone in a jester mask, and as he chases them, the cops think that they're working together. We get a very cool chase sequence here, and some awesome cutscenes, really pumping up the action. Yagami is saved by the thief who returns his phone and leaves. Yagami heads to the Genda law office, waiting for Kaito to get in contact with the dirty cop Ayabe. Shintani has an interview with Hattori set up, causing Yagami to leave. Before he does, he gets a job from Genda. Now, there's a lot of derails in the story that sort of force you to do side cases or friend jobs that aren't really connected to the overall plot. I won't really be talking about these too much, as most of them are there to introduce us to new mechanics and break up the story a bit. Yagami meets Kaito at Koi Bride, an indoor fishing pool. We're attacked by a group of enemies looking for Ayabe. Koi Bride is then unearthed to be a front for Lamont, a secret underground casino. Inside is Ayabe. He gives them a package containing information they need, but they have to open it in private. He also gives them some extra information that the lead investigator on the case is Kuroiwa, Ayabe's boss. Yagami is attacked by some men in ski masks on the way back to his office. The unknown assailants head out, and Yagami reviews the information Ayabe gave him. Apparently, the cops know as little as they do, but they did find out the second victim of the mole was named Kunimura. He left the brothel named Konban Wife 2 hours before he died. He was with a girl named Kane. Before we move on, I'd like to note here that Yagami's office has a few cool features. It mainly serves as our base of operations in the story and in the game. We can rest up here as usual, but we can also customize the place. We can put little trinkets that we earn around the room. We can also play records that we find. It's a nice little home base and has a very cozy feel. I don't think it's nearly as well executed as something like the Survive Bar in Yakuza 7, but it still works really well. Yagami decides to try and find Kane, but at Konban Wife, Hamura is there. He beats Yagami and is clearly protecting someone, as he tells Yagami to stop looking into the murders and that Kane left Kamurocho. Yagami tries to enlist the help of Matsugane, but apparently Hamura has been bankrolling the family for a while and no one would listen to Matsugane's orders. Yagami has to meet Hamura at Cafe Alps. There, Hamura and his crew beat Yagami some more for snitching on him. He almost stabs Yagami's eyes out with an ice pick, but Yagami breaks free, and we have to fight Kengo and Ozaki. Kengo isn't too bad, but Ozaki is a big, lumbering brute. He's hard to take down and can do a ton of damage to us easily. Hamura has Kengo pull a gun on Yagami, but Jester breaks in and saves him. We have to run away from the group with Jester, and we get one of the coolest quick-time sequences in Yakuza history. As you can clearly tell, Judgment doesn't hold back on the wacky Yakuza style. It keeps that same flair and level of intensity that we've always loved. Yagami catches up with Jester, who tells him he only stole his phone to use Yagami as bait. He gave it back when Yagami caught up with him because he had earned his respect. Yagami tells him he should stop being a thief, and Jester reveals that he knows Yagami's name already. Back at the office, Kaito has beat down 4 Matsugane family members, but the final one, Toru Higashi, is still standing. Kaito used to be Higashi's Aniki before he got kicked out of the Yakuza. When he leaves, the two remark that Higashi has been changed greatly since they last saw him a year ago. Kaito asks Yagami to tail him, and we do some following around the city, and eventually get to a game center called Charles. Yagami uses a disguise and gets in to finally speak with Higashi. Higashi says that his new personality is real, but Yagami talks about the last time he saw him, 1 year ago. Someone broke into the Matsugane family offices and stole 100 million yen. Kaito was watching the place at the time and had to lose a pinky for it. Yagami and Matsugane stopped Hamura because it wouldn't bring the money back. Kaito was kicked out of the family but didn't have to lose his fingers because that's a punishment for a Yakuza, and Kaito was a civilian. This is why Hamura hates Yagami so much. He feels like he stepped in where he shouldn't have. Before Yagami leaves, he asks Higashi what really happened to the stolen money, and Higashi tells him that's none of his business. Kaito tells Yagami that they'll have to talk to Ayabe if they want to learn how Higashi got the money back. We head to Tender to look for him, but Masuda has a job for us. We meet with the new client at the Hill Garden, Crow. He's part of the burglary ring in Kamurocho and wants us to find Jester. At first, Crow tells us that Jester has gone MIA and they're worried about him. We quickly realize that the ring has turned into something nefarious. They aren't stealing from the rich and giving to the poor anymore. They're stealing from everyone and buying themselves expensive jewelry. We end up fighting them, and Crow decides to dismantle the group. We can assume that Jester left the group because of how it had changed. Yagami meets up with Ayabe, who tells him he needs 100,000 yen if he wants info on the Matsugane money. We give it to him and he tells us what he knows. Apparently, Kaito had a gun put to the back of his head by someone who snuck in past the cameras. Kaito was knocked out and Higashi saw the man's face. He was a homeless man that they call Red Nose. Higashi ended up getting the money back from him, but Kaito wasn't allowed back in the family. We try and ask around about the homeless to try and find out where Red Nose is, eventually revealing that he was killed in the sewers a year ago. The homeless man thought it was Higashi because he was the only one that asked about him before his death. Kaito doesn't believe Higashi would kill a man like that, but the two storm Charles anyways. Inside, Higashi pulls a gun and Yagami disarms him. He admits that he didn't kill Red Nose. The theft was actually about getting Kaito out of the family, rather than stealing the money. Red Nose had help from the inside, but it wasn't Higashi, it was Hamada. Higashi was there when Red Nose died. Hamada was going to pay him 10 million yen for the job, but Higashi blew their cover and they had to kill him. Hamada forced Higashi to pull the trigger, and he's now being blackmailed with his prints on the gun. Yagami leaves Kaito and Higashi to repair their friendship. Higashi says that Yagami rubs him the wrong way, and we get some insight into Yagami's backstory. Yagami's father was a respected defense attorney. When Yagami was 15, his dad got a murderer with all the evidence against him acquitted. Yagami was gone one day at a friend's house, angry because his father and mother worked so much. While he was gone, they were killed by one of the victim's family members. Yagami blames himself for this, of course, and has been haunted by it ever since. Kaito ended up helping Yagami out, and Matsugane took him under his wing, paying for him to go to law school. Higashi and the Charles clerk are being beaten by Hamada and his men. Kengo and Kurimoto go to have a smoke, but they're shot at from behind. Kurimoto is killed and Kengo survives. Yagami and Kaito hear the news the next day. They think that it was someone from the Kyodai trying to start a war with the Matsugane family. They also learn that the victim was shot in the back and once in each eye, replicating the mole killings. Over at the Genda Law Office, we get sidetracked into a case of the missing cake from the fridge. Hoshino also does a classic Phoenix Wright pose referencing the famous detective lawyer video game series. Higashi tells Yagami that Hamada is in hiding. He also believes that the hit was on him because Kurimoto looks a lot like Hamada from the back and was dressed similarly to him. To make matters worse, Kyodai's second-in-command, Satoshi Shioya, has arrived in Kamurocho. Higashi thinks that Shintani might be the next target because he got Hamada freed from jail. Yagami warns Shintani, but he's more worried about Yagami investigating the mole. He tells Yagami flat out to stop looking down this path, and even gives him a cryptic warning. Yagami realizes that he must know something since he's talked to Hamada. Yagami talks to Ayabe to try and get some information on the shooting. Apparently the only reason that Kyodai are in Kamurocho is because they're backed by the Kajihara Group. The Kajihara Group is a construction firm that wants to expand into Kamurocho. They have connections with the Minister of Health, Kazumi. Another interesting feature that's been introduced into Judgment that we haven't talked about yet is conversations. We have a lot of choices of what to say when we're talking to someone in the story. We have to choose the right options to get the optimal amount of information. Of course, the outcome is always going to be the same, but picking the right phrases will give us a small amount of SP. The amount of SP you get is really tiny and doesn't make that much of a difference, but this was always a little reward that I tried to get regardless, just because it was there. Also, the reward being so small makes it so that you're not grief-stricken if you get a couple prompts wrong. As Yagami leaves, Kuroiwa and Sakuraba show up, Ayabe's bosses. They say that Kuroiwa has been shamed since Hamada was acquitted, and they throw the Okubo case in his face, the one that ended his career. Kaito and Yagami head to KJ Art to try and find out more about the construction firm behind it all. They're led into a trap and Jester steps in once again to save them. Jester helps us defeat the goons, including Shioya, the second in command. We finally get to know the real Jester, who reveals himself to be Fumiya Sugiura. Don't worry, this isn't a character that you're supposed to know. I know it can be pretty easy to get lost in the sheer amount of characters in a Yakuza game, but trust me, this is a new one. Apparently he started the burglary ring with good intentions, but had to end it after he found money being funneled into the Kyodai and KJ Art by the Kajihara Group. Yagami heads back to his office and gets a call from Saori, the girl that works at the Genda Law Office. She can't get a hold of Shintani and Yagami calls him.
Shintani here.
Hey, Shintani-sensei, it's Tak. Where are you?
You've reached the voicemail box of the one and only Masamichi Shintani.
He then hears a phone in his closet and opens it to find Shintani's body. Yagami calls Sayori and tells her what happened as she calls the police for him. Yagami believes Shintani had to be killed outside of the office and planted here because there's no blood and he was shot in the chest. He finds his phone and looks at his most recent call, but before we can investigate, the police arrive, led by Kuroiwa. Kuroiwa tells Yagami to leave and find somewhere else to sleep while they investigate. Yagami heads over to Genda's office to talk to him about Shintani. Genda warns Yagami to leave town because he believes he might be in danger. Genda walks Sayori to the station, and Hoshino promises to help Yagami find the mole and avenge Shintani. They find out that Shintani called the ADDC right before he died. The ADDC is the Advanced Drug Development Center, and 3 years ago, Okubo was a laundryman there, accused of murdering a patient. Yagami sleeps at the office and promises to meet Hoshino at the Charles Arcade the next day. Hoshino, Kaito, and Sugiura are all there, and Yagami fills them in. The ADDC was in the news recently for announcing a new drug called AD9 that's in animal testing. The director, Ryusuke Kido, published a paper on the drug and gained notoriety. Yagami recognizes him from when he was investigating the place for his last case as an attorney. Apparently the drug is huge, and the ADDC is adding a whole new building for research on it. Hoshino and Yagami decide to head to the ADDC to get information. Before they head out, Sugiura asks Yagami's opinion on the Okubo case that ended his career all those years ago. He says he thinks that he was probably innocent, but he couldn't defend him again after he was accused of killing Emi. When they arrive at the ADDC, Yagami starts to have flashbacks to when he and Shintani visited this place. He heads to the reception desk and sees Kido walking up, and we jump back 3 years. The director is meeting Yagami and Shintani as they're investigating the place for Okubo's case. Kido wanted the case over quickly as it's bad press for the ADDC. Regardless, he gives them a tour guide, Terasawa, the woman that would end up dead. She takes them to Waku's room, the victim in Okubo's case. Waku had dementia and Alzheimer's, and investigating the room, we realize it would have been impossible to see the patient's head from the outside, so someone else could have been in the room posing as Waku. We learn the details of the case from Shintani. Okubo confessed to burying the body in the mountains, but said he didn't kill the man. He also broke his girlfriend's finger 6 years ago, which doesn't look good on his case. They leave and head to talk to Okubo. Okubo maintains his innocence and hadn't seen Waku that day. 3 days earlier, though, Waku had attacked him after accusing him of stealing his wallet, a side effect of the dementia. Back at the office, everyone is teasing Yagami about Mafuyu. Shintani is outside and found someone eavesdropping and was tased. We have to chase the person and find out it's Terasawa. Yagami questions her at Tender later. She meant to give them information, but Shintani scared her. She reveals that there was someone that saw Waku in his bed, Kido's right-hand man, Shono, a top scientist at the ADDC. In the courtroom, Terasawa is brought up and brings Shono's testimony into question. This opens up the case for the ability to prove Okubo's innocence, and basically tells everyone that Shono is lying. Another new system that Judgment introduces is the ability to choose evidence at certain points in the story. Sometimes we'll have to prove a point or back up our statements, and selecting the right evidence is integral to not making us look stupid. This reminds me a lot of something like the Danganronpa series or even Phoenix Wright. I'd also like to quickly talk about the case files system here. This menu serves as our quests or missions screen for the game. It's really well done though, because each case that we take on has a list of who's involved, what evidence we found, and a summary of what we know so far. This is updated as we find out new information, and it's a fantastic way to be able to keep track of what's going on. It's also probably incredibly helpful for new players because I know a lot of people have trouble remembering names or who's who. The courtroom quickly descends into arguments about the character of Okubo and Shono. Terasawa stands up to defend Okubo's character, saying he stopped drinking alcohol after the incident with her finger, and also revealing that the two are dating. Okubo didn't tell anyone because he didn't want her to get hurt. Her interjection affected the jury and Okubo was found innocent, but a month later, Emi Terasawa was murdered by Okubo. We jump back to present day, and Kido and Shono are meeting Yagami. Yagami tells them about the call that was made, and they find that Shintani called Shono, but he didn't answer and left no voicemail. Yagami is confused, but Kido brushes it off because they get a lot of prank calls. Yagami brings up the fact that maybe the ADDC had something to do with the mole murders, and Kido is offended. Kuroiwa then enters with the police and take Yagami in as a material witness. Yagami thinks that they're arresting him, but Hoshino finds out the interview is voluntary. Kuroiwa threatens Yagami with a warrant, but he leaves. Hoshino and Yagami still want to talk to Shono, but Kido won't let them. Luckily, Shono's assistant is in the reception area and offers to take them to the research wing. Hashimoto tells them that AD9 is the leading drug that could lead to a cure to Alzheimer's. If it all works out, the drug, Shono, and Kido could go down in history. They almost get to question Shono, but Ichinose shows up, the Vice Minister of Health, and prevents this. Kido arrives as well and has them kicked out, with Ichinose threatening to have Minister Kazumi contact the Bar Association. Yagami then realizes he heard Ayabe talk about Kazumi before. He was involved with the Kajihara group that was backing the Kyodai. Hoshino thinks they should talk to Sugiura, who worked for Kajihara, when they call him, and he tells them he'll look into it. Back in Kamurocho, Hoshino got word that Hattori, the nosy journalist, was trying to get an interview with Yagami about Shintani's murder, and Hoshino leaves to deal with him. We get dragged into another side case that deals with Kaito and an old friend. I do have one big complaint about Judgment's story. I think the overall story is really good. There's a ton of great new and interesting characters. The murder mystery is incredibly interesting, and the way that all of the information is presented is really well done. I especially love Yagami's dynamic, someone whose guilt has traveled with him and forced him to leave being an attorney, but is still sort of pursuing an underground version of that career. He's shamed and no one will let him forget it. This sets up a great character and a lot of interesting situations. Kaito and Yagami's dynamic is great as well. These two might have one of my favorite bromances in a Yakuza game. That being said, the way the story is paced can be quite annoying at certain points. Judgment includes all type of side cases for us to get lost in, but they for some reason can't just leave those side cases to the side. There are certain situations where they're necessary, like the Jester side case. We find out a lot about the burglary ring and Jester himself in this story, and it's a big part of that character that ties into the overall plot. But other ones, like this one with Kaito, or the missing cake side case, or the divorce side case, are all kind of unnecessary to have connected to the main story. They should have either just made it a part of the main game or made them side cases that weren't required for completing the game. It's really weird because a lot of them really do feel like classic Yakuza sub-stories, but in the middle of this huge massive plot, we're constantly taken away from it for an hour to find out who ate the cake or where this kid that's obsessed with Captain Cop's dad is. And don't get me wrong, most of these sub-stories are really, really good. The missing cake sub-story was really funny. The fact that we have to use our incredible powers of deduction to solve who ate Sayori's cake is a great scenario, but forcing it into the middle of the story is kind of odd. Yagami meets Sugiura at Koi Bride. Apparently Kajihara and Kazuma were meeting about tearing down the ADDC and redeveloping the property. Kazumi already wanted to shut down the ADDC because of a tax scam. Kajihara bought the land around the place and bribed Kazumi, but then AD9 was announced and the redevelopment was disbanded. Sugiura got all of the information from an article written by Hattori. He thinks it isn't credible, but Yagami says that it is because it was written by Hattori. Yagami heads back to Genda's office and finds Mafuyu there. Apparently Izumida and Morita want to bring Yagami in for Shintani's murder, and she's being kept out of the loop. Sugiura calls Yagami because he saw Mafuyu being tailed by Yakuza. We trace the Yakuza down, fighting through multiple groups. They eventually try to take Mafuyu, and Yagami, with the help of Kaito, stops them. Sugiura tails the van and finds them to be Kyodai Yakuza. Mafuyu begs Yagami to leave Kamurocho with her, but he tells her about the ADDC. Yagami, Kaito, and Sugiura storm the Kyodai at a cabaret club. We have to fight through tons of goons in many different areas of the club. Eventually, we find Shioya, who says he has a job for them, and wanted to take Mafuyu as insurance that they would accept. They refuse since Mafuyu was hit in the process and we have to battle them. Our boss battle with Shioya is pretty easy outside of the tons of enemies in the place. We have a bunch of weapons we can use though, and it makes this a lot easier. It becomes pretty simple once we get Shioya by himself. After the battle, Hattori enters the club with Shigeru Kajihara himself. Kajihara apparently was testing them and they all passed. He wants them to look into Hashiki's death, the vice director of the ADDC. He died in a drunken fight 6 months ago. He bribed the vice director when he was trying to have the ADDC redeveloped, but as we know, that turned out to be a bust. He thinks that Hashiki was killed because he was investigating AD9, and he thinks the drug is too good to be true. He thinks Okubo, Shintani, and all of it was connected. Yagami tells Hoshino to look into Hashiki's death, and the next day they meet with him and Genda. Hashiki was found beaten in an alleyway in a coma and died weeks later in the hospital. He was last seen fighting with a man in a black raincoat. Kaito thinks this could have been a hit because a professional killer would have been able to make this look like a drunken brawl. Yagami wants to enlist the help of Ayabe again, but he's being pressured by Kuroiwa, so he's sent someone else. At the casino, they meet their contact. We quickly realize that it's actually Mafuyu in a wig, and she gives Yagami the file. Hashiki was at a cabaret club an hour before he died called Queen Rouge. He was there with Shono, but apparently Shono had an alibi. They head to the club to investigate, but they can't enter without being members. Kaito and Yagami come up with the idea to get one of the girls to work there and get information for them. The manager has taken a liking to Saori, so we have to convince her with some sweets. We get some mochi for her from a nearby dessert seller. Back at the office, Genda has returned. He's been in a depression since Shintani died. The man was like a son to him, and now he's worried about Hoshino and Yagami as well. He doesn't want anyone else to die, but he's sick of wallowing and has decided to put his support behind Yagami. When Yagami tells Saori about the plan to get her to work at the Rouge, she declines. Hoshino finally interjects, and she's immediately convinced. We take her to a dress store to get her a makeover, and she continues to tease Yagami about Mafuyu. We realize that Mafuyu and Yagami knew each other since they were young, but they grew apart and reconnected in law school. Saori tells Yagami about Mafuyu. She lost her mother in a hit and run. They caught the culprit, and Chief Prosecutor Morita became her idol and first crush. We have to give Saori a bit of a makeover here, using a similar system to the previous Hostess minigames we've seen in the Yakuza series. We have an odd sequence here where we walk along the streets, first person controlling Saori, and have to hear the catcalls from men on the side of the streets.
Hey, where's she work? That's where I want to be. Huh?
The manager is taken aback by Saori's beauty and hires her immediately. We have to control Saori here and entertain some men in the club. She eventually meets Mika, a hostess who tells her that on her first night, 6 months ago, a customer yelled at her and was beaten to death outside. Mika wants to hang out more with Saori, and she suggests they go to Tender. Saori calls Yagami to meet up with them later. During Saori's shift, Yagami heads back to the office. Outside is Kuroiwa, Ayabe, and Kuroiwa's partner, Sakuraba. Kuroiwa tells him that there's a leak in the prosecutor's office. He believes it's a woman who stole information on Hashiki's murder, clearly talking about Mafuyu. Before he leaves, he tells Yagami that Izumida wants to talk to him about Shintani's murder. Saori calls him and he heads to Tender to meet her and Mika. Mika confirms who the men were and says that Hashiki was complaining about Kido. The argument started when Hashiki was asking Shono about the authenticity of AD9. Yagami takes Saori back to the office, and Hoshino is also taken by her new look. Yagami believes Hashiki's death was for a purpose, probably to shut him up about AD9. They don't know if the drug is legit and think that it might just be a way to keep the ADDC open. They believe the man in the black raincoat was a hired gun, probably by Kido, but they can't talk to him. Yagami thinks the prosecutor's office will help him. Ayabe calls him on his way back to his office and reminds him about his meeting with the prosecutors. He has a bad feeling about the whole thing, and he doesn't even know why he's suspected for Shintani's murder. Yagami is questioned about everything surrounding the murder, so Yagami is up front. He tells them all about AD9, Hashiki, Kajihara, and the Kyorai. Just then, Morita gets a call. Ayabe has been arrested for Shintani's murder. The bullet was traced back to his gun. The prosecutors apologize to Yagami and tell him they had to keep him in the dark until they found out it was Ayabe. They've known about his corruption for a while, but will fully unveil it now. Ayabe calls and insists that he's innocent and he needs Yagami's help. Yagami decides to take on the case and calls Genda to tell him. He and Hoshino go visit Ayabe at the detention center. Ayabe says that the rifling marks on the bullet were his, connected to his gun. It had to have been stolen, and the night of Shintani's murder, he was knocked out and woke up in the children's park with his gun and a full clip of bullets. He kept quiet because he didn't want his shady business getting out. Yagami thinks that it could have been the mole, and they'll need to talk to Hamada again. Yagami meets with Higashi to try and find out where Matsugane and Hamada are. He says he'll try and find them and calls them later to say he set up a meet at a restaurant outside of Kamurocho. At the restaurant, he reveals he doesn't know where Hamada is. He's in hiding to protect the entire family. He begs the two not to track him down because it could get Hamada or them killed. Hamada brings in the money for the family, so it would mean the end for them. Yagami says they can't stop, telling him about all the connections. Kaito chooses Yagami over the family and says he doesn't care if he's never a Yakuza again.
Boss, I've always looked up to you. And good Yakuza don't disobey. But now, I'm in Yagami's corner, damn it.
Matsugane leaves and Higashi is forced to fight the two. He's a pretty difficult battle and carries a knife the whole time. One big change I noticed with the Combat of Judgment is that the bosses can do a ton of damage. If you catch one powerful attack without dodging or blocking, you'll get most of your health bar taken away. It becomes a lot clearer as we get into the second half of the game, but it can be a lot. Now, we can still get healing items, so it's not a huge problem, but our inventory is also shortened from the more recent entries, needing to be upgraded with skill points. We can buy a ton of smaller health items from Poppo stores, but a lot of the normal healing items, like Toughness Z, start out with a limit of 3 in our inventory. After we defeat Higashi, Matsugane returns and laments how old he's gotten. He remembers 20 years ago. Kaito was beating on a teenaged Yagami. Yagami insulted Matsugane and he saw something good in him, some strength to be able to stand up to him. He realized that he was better than him or Kaito and decided to teach him what he knew to survive in the city. Matsugane tells them that the mole is a hired gun that Hamada has used before. He tells them that even if they catch him, they're just pawns in a larger game. Yagami thinks that the Matsugane family wouldn't just let a serial killer run loose, and Matsugane tells him that Hamada is the Matsugane family now. When they leave, Kaito realizes that Hamada has to have been communicating with the family since he's leading them now. They decide to bug the Matsugane family office. They meet with Tsukumo, who gives them some high-quality bugs. Sugiyoda has a plan. A man named Tashiro is in the Yakuza. They can jump him and steal his clothes, then Yagami can disguise himself and plant the bugs. We fight Tashiro and take his look. We get inside and have a time limit to set up the bugs. Yagami's cover is blown and he's saved by Sugiyoda. Sugiyoda hears one of their calls on the bug and it's to Hamada. He hears Chohan and deduces that the man must be at a gambling hall. We head to Lamont and find someone who knows about a secret gambling hall in the Champion District. They give us the password and Yagami and Kaito head over. There, Hamada and Ozaki are making a ruckus. We have to fight both of them and all their goons. This is a pretty rough battle. I took quite a bit of mortal wounds during it. They're strong boys, and Ozaki especially deals a lot of damage when you can't focus him. When they're defeated, we finally get to question Hamada. Yagami asks if Kido is behind the whole thing, and Hamada starts laughing. We realize then he was just a distraction all along. The one behind everything was Dr. Shono. Before Hamada can be interrogated anymore, the Matsugane set the hall on fire and save Hamada. The two escape just before a grenade is thrown. Yagami meets with Hoshino, who tells him that he has found an expert on AD9, Hattori. The meeting starts off smug, but eventually he cuts the act and gives Yagami information on the drug. Apparently the drug eats away at the protein that causes Alzheimer's or dementia in the brain. Its animal tests were successful, but they're moving on to human trials now. It's a real miracle drug, but Yagami thinks it's too good to be true. Eventually, he realizes something, that Shono wrote the paper, but that it was credited to Kido. He meets up with the group back at the office and reveals his theory. All of the murders that the mole completed were an experiment with AD9. Kaito is skeptical, thinking that it doesn't make sense to test the drug on people who don't have dementia, but they would need a control group, and there was someone that was killed with dementia, Waku. Everything starts to add up, the possibility that maybe Waku was the first victim. Shono could have gotten ambitious and impatient, wanting to test the drug too quickly. Sugiura eventually has an outburst at Yagami, saying it's all too convenient, and Kaito shuts him up. They realize the only way to find out the truth is to talk to Okubo and find out if he really killed Waku. Yagami heads back to the Genda office to go over the case files. Genda asks Yagami why he's going over that old case. Yagami is really pursuing his own motivations here at this point. He wants to know the truth. He wants to know if this guilt that he's been feeling all these years was for nothing. Genda tells Yagami that he needs to stop carrying that guilt, that it isn't worth it. But Yagami says that if he wasn't good at his job, Terasawa wouldn't have died. Yagami and Hoshino head to the detention center to talk to Okubo, who years later has long hair and looks disheveled. Okubo hasn't spoken to anyone in a long time. He's distraught, but Yagami tells him that they may have found a suspect in Waku's murder. He says that he knows who Shono is, and that he put the body in his truck. If he would have just called the police, none of this would have happened. Yagami believes he didn't kill Waku, but doesn't ask about Terasawa. Yagami heads to Tender and is confronted by Karoiwa. He makes snide remarks at Yagami's expense yet again, and as Yagami leaves, he's confronted by the Cane Man. He has a bunch of health and mortally wounds pretty easily with his katana, so we have to be careful to dodge him. After we defeat him, he leaves without any information or motivation. Yagami calls Kaito and warns him, possibly thinking the man was sent by Hamura. The group meets at KJ Art, the last place Hamura would attack, now with Kajihara protecting them. Murase is giving Kaito a massage, now being polite at the request of Kajihara. They decide it's time to meet face to face with Shono and decide to confront him. They try to get to him at the office but are stopped by Ichinose. Hashimoto thankfully tells them that he makes his morning rounds, and they can catch him then. The two are prepared to sneak in through the garage and wait there until morning. They're attacked by some guards led by Mashiko, a man with a baton. He's pretty powerful, but his attacks are easily avoided. Sugiura and Yagami steal some uniforms and wait inside until Shono makes his rounds. They get to talking, and Sugiura's brainstorming leads Yagami to think that Shono framed Okubo for Terasawa's murder. Shono sees them in the morning and tries to run away. We have to fight some scientists and guards and eventually corner him in Waku's room. Yagami accuses him of Waku's murder. Yagami lays the whole thing out in front of Shono, that he killed Waku testing the drug and framed Okubo. When he was found innocent, he tested the drug on Terasawa and had her murdered, injecting Okubo with alcohol to make him look drunk. Yagami knows that Shono is guilty, but Kido steps in. Yagami asks him if they need more humans to test their drug on, and this terrifies Kido. Yagami tells him that they'll stop at nothing to end all this, even if it means his own death. We jump back to 3 years ago and see Okubo being interrogated. He's brutally abused and convinced into confessing. Without Yagami there to defend him this time, he cracked. Yagami visits Okubo again and tells him that he believes he's innocent. This causes Okubo to break down in a scene of true relief and triumph.
I believe you. You didn't kill her. I can see that now. It'll all work out. I'm gonna avenge Emi-chan. And I swear I'm gonna get you out of here. I promise. Sorry, I should have said that to you a lot sooner. What was I doing? These 3 years, I didn't do a damn thing to help you.
Yagami asks if he can defend him, to which Okubo accepts, for Terasawa's sake as well. The group are in a van listening to the bugs they had planted. Flying the drone, he finds Higashi doling out orders. Kaito and Yagami tail him, but this time he's got a huge group of guys. We have to make sure to keep eyes on Higashi the whole time, but also not get caught by any of his goons. As they leave one by one, we find Higashi by himself. He wanted to speak to them and knew they were tailing, but he needed to be somewhere that Matsugane couldn't hear them. Hamura is trying to catch them and giving it his all. Higashi is being kept out of the loop on Hamura's location and tells them to leave Kamurocho as it would be safer. The two decide that they'll try and lure Hamura out. Yagami is in an alleyway by himself and is jumped by Matsugane men. Kaito arrives to help out. We fight them off, and then Yagami and Kaito follow them. They're led into a trap set by Hamada. Matsugane tries to convince him not to shoot Yagami, and he turns his gun on his boss. Kaito takes a bullet for the man, and Sugiura shows up to save him. They escape, and we have to leave Kaito. Back in the van, Sugiura says he found out where they were from the bugs. The only lead he has is the Soy Lyle building. The two arrive at the place and we have to make our way through. The Cane Man is here and we have to fight him many different times throughout the place. His weapon switches each time, changing into a bow staff and a sword. It's kind of awesome. Our final battle with him sees him in the dark, and I was wondering why my movements weren't working the whole time, and I realized it was because I had to turn the lights on. I thought this was such a cool little touch to this set piece. At the top of the building, Kaito is being held with a gun to his head. Hamada is headbutted by Kaito, and we have to fight the man. It's pretty similar to the previous fights, and was pretty easy. I thought this little chair action piece in the middle was amazing though, and really reminded me of some classic Jackie Chan movies. After Hamada is defeated, Kaito is freed. Higashi and Matsugane help the men out and take Kaito to a doctor. Yagami and Matsugane take Hamada to the Kyorai Cabaret Club, and Shioya is ecstatic. He's glad that they can finally put an end to their war, and will drop everything if they can keep Hamada after all this is done. Yagami accepts. We finally begin to interrogate Hamada, uninterrupted. Yagami lays out what he knows in front of Hamada. Shioya is impressed, and Matsugane has this funny line where he comments that he paid for his schooling, acting like a total dad.
Nerve. You're a real crack detective, Yagami.
You know, I personally funded his time at law school. He never would have passed the bar without me.
Hamada met the mole as an informant who sold information and forged documents. He's been working with him for 20 years. He started to get unnerved when he realized how easily he could get rid of a body. He says he needed to use the mole because it was all about money, but the money wasn't for greed, it was to make the family strong. The first hit they had to do was on Hashiki and was requested by a middleman, Ishimatsu. Hamada was creeped out by the guy, but it paid 10 million. A few months later, they were asked to gather test subjects for AD9 and get rid of the bodies. We jump back months ago to see Hamada meeting with Ishimatsu. He's offering 100 million yen for each Kyorai man brought to them alive. Everything is proven. Hamada was asked to gather the subjects officially by Ichinose, Shono, and Kido. They were trying to test AD9 on humans. Everyone involved needed to keep the ADDC running. If it stopped, they'd lose tons of money, their retirements, their positions. Shono specifically wanted to kill Yakuza because he felt he'd sleep better at night. Hamada says he had to start a fight with Kume because the Kyorai were getting suspicious after 2 of them were already killed. Apparently, Shono has a secret lab that Hamada hasn't seen. Yagami asks him about the eye gouging, and Hamada thinks it's just some fetish of the moles. Shintani was killed when Ichinose forced him to cover up some loose ends. Just then, the group smells fire, and Hamada says the mole and Matsugane have arrived to burn the place down. Matsugane puts Hamada at gunpoint, and we have to guide them through the burning building. This part is really great, mostly because we have to fight groups of enemies and we can push or throw them into the fire to damage them. We eventually have to fight Ozaki, and the fire makes that a lot easier. The Matsugane men are beating up Shioya in the lobby and the mole arrives. He goes to shoot Hamada, but Matsugane steps in front of the bullet. He kills multiple Matsugane men before the building begins to collapse and he's forced to leave. As Matsugane dies, he apologizes to Hamada for forcing the hard choices on him.
Doc, my boy. This is it for me. Hurry and get out.
Not without you. Let's go!
The mole is Kuroiwa. Now you know the truth.
Yagami gets Matsugane's body out and is sitting on the steps, despondent. Mafuyu tries to comfort him, but Kuroiwa shows up and Yagami is angry at him, clearly believing what Hamada told him. He says they'll meet at the police station. Yagami goes with him and is handcuffed. Yagami tells him that Hamada told him everything and Kuroiwa ignores it all. Kuroiwa assures Yagami that this won't end with him alive. Plus, Kuroiwa is completely protected by the Ministry of Health. Kuroiwa lets Yagami leave, reporting that he was just a witness. Yagami checks on Kaito, who's going to be okay with a couple days' rest. The next day, Yagami gets a call that the mole has completed his next killing. Shioya was murdered. He tells Mafuyu everything, and that the Ministry of Health men are watching him now. But this is too big to stop looking into. Nothing will stop him at this point. Before we get to the finale of the game, I'd like to quickly talk about the music of Judgment. Judgment's soundtrack is great, and has changed to reflect the differences in gameplay and tone from previous Yakuza games. A lot of tracks are these slow, jazzy, noir-styled pieces. Beginning is one of these tracks. It's slow with a groovy piano and funky drums coming through. The prominent hi-hats make us feel like we're sitting at a desk, reviewing a case, the whole room only lit by a lamp as cigarette smoke fills the room. But just because these jazzy tracks litter the OST doesn't mean that Judgment doesn't have those classic Yakuza bangers. Random fire beats into the soundtrack, hard snares and dramatic pianos cascade onto the scene and ooze with the vibe of coming panic. Penumbra, the final battle track, starts out slow and melodic. Foreboding strings and heavy drums thrum in the background, but there's a section in the middle where the song breaks into synths, and it almost feels triumphant, even a little melancholic or sad. The whole OST is fantastic and really reflects the changes that the game makes overall. It sets a great new tone without changing too much in general. We jump to Matsugane's funeral. The Matsugane family is basically over since Hamura is gone. Kaito and Higashi are spying on Kuroiwa, who notices them. Yagami and Hoshino are at the courthouse going over pre-trial information for Ayabe's case. They tell Ayabe that Kuroiwa is the mole, and he says that it checks out. His mentor was found dead after selling police information. Hattori shows up at Yagami's office later and tells him he's being watched. He was sent by Kajihara. Yagami tells him everything about the mole and AD9. Hattori tells him that Kajihara wants to meet with him at Kikunoya. Kaito is upstairs and tells Yagami that Kajihara is being pressured by the Kyorai clan chairman, Koba. They meet with Kajihara and he toasts Matsugane. Kajihara says that Koba wants the killing of his men stopped, and they all need to work together towards that goal. They want to reveal everything at Ayabe's trial, but they need a witness like Hamura or it won't take. They could go after Kuroiwa, but they don't have the time to go after that lead. On top of all of this, Okubo has been put on the list of death row inmates set to be executed. They need someone in the ADDC like Kido, but how do they get to him? They suggest a honey trap, using Sayori to lure him out. Sayori is disguised as a journalist, and we have to dress her up again. She installs a camera in her purse, and Kido, of course, makes some gross moves against her in the interview. They use this information to blackmail Kido and force him to Kamurocho at the batting cages. There, he tries to fight back, but we trounce him and his goons. The group takes him back to Charles in his underwear. Kido reveals he knew about Waku's murder. We jump back and see Kido and Shono having a toast. Shono tells Kido that the clinical trials for AD9 could result in death and reveals that Okubo was innocent. Shono blackmailed Kido into not calling the police. He also confessed to murdering the girl. Kido was only working with them to fulfill the demands they were making. He doesn't know where the secret lab is, but Kuroiwa and Ishimatsu do. Yagami has Kido set up a meeting with Ishimatsu so we can tail him to the lab. This is the longest tail in the game, and Ishimatsu is very skittish. He'll turn around and head backwards around corners just to make sure no one is following him. He also takes a crazy paranoid path through the city. Eventually we trace him to an abandoned love hotel. Yagami has Mafuyu call the cops and send them here. They can't bring the lab to the trial, but he has some ideas. We fight our way through the place, even having to short out a locked door with a portable massager. Sugiura is almost hanged at one point, and we have to defeat the goons trying to kill him before he dies. We're also faced with the same hangman that we fought in Yakuza 6, who is actually a pretty difficult fight. His hammer attacks do ridiculous amounts of damage. We have to avoid most attacks because one can send you into the red. They find the lab and Shono in it. Yagami tells Sugiura to start recording, and suddenly he starts acting strange. He reveals that he isn't who he said he was. He never worked for Kajihara. He's actually Terasawa's brother, Fumiya Terasawa. He goes to stab Shono for killing his sister, but is stopped when the police arrive. He's arrested for attempted murder, promising that no charges will be pressed. They're just trying to get him out of there. Yagami confesses to trespassing, which means the police are obligated to investigate the place. Yagami thinks he's won when he realizes that Morita is involved in the conspiracy. Just then, Kuroiwa enters Charles and beats Kaito and Higashi, freeing Kido. They leave Yagami and Ichinose delivers a message from Kido. Kuroiwa sends his regards. Yagami heads back to Charles with Kaito and Higashi recouping. Yagami has only bad news to report. Fumiya enters and decides to come clean. He was originally angry at Yagami and he started the burglary ring, but eventually got close and saw his side of things. Now he feels powerless to find his sister's real killer with everything going on. Yagami is determined though. Mafuyu meets Yagami and Kaito at Tender. She looked into Morita's past to figure out why he's in on the conspiracy. Mafuyu is supposed to meet with a detective who worked on the case that dealt with whatever happened to Morita's family. Kaito and Yagami go with her to be her bodyguards so they can see the information. We get attacked by thugs on the way out and have to defend Mafuyu. We can't let her health get to 0 or we lose. We fight waves and waves of enemies, but the final wave is the hardest, with 2 larger bosses and tons of goons. They meet the detective who is Uzawa, the detective that we started the game tailing. The file tells them everything about Morita's past and family. 10 years ago, his brother strangled their mother who was suffering from Alzheimer's. He ended up taking his own life afterwards. This explains why he would support AD9. Mafuyu and Yagami head back to the Genda law office and find Sayori and Hoshino holding hands. Eventually, they tell the two what they found out. Hoshino begs Yagami to take on Ayabe's trial because he doesn't think he's a good fit to do it. Yagami agrees, deciding to finally enter the courtroom fully again. When Yagami walks Mafuyu back to her taxi, she gets a call from Izumida asking her to meet at a coffee shop. Yagami offers to go in her place because he thinks Izumida might be involved in the whole thing as well. Izumida is not, however, and wanted to talk to Mafuyu about Morita turning coat. Yagami finally gets an idea, to have Ichinose testify in Ayabe's trial, which would provide him the link he needs to the ADDC and prove the framing. Izumida agrees and Yagami heads back to the office to talk to the group. Genda and Ayabe approve of Yagami returning as lead attorney, and Yagami can't tell what to call Sugiura. Sugiura decides to keep his new name. We have 3 different options at this point to tie up loose ends. We can choose in what order we go about these, but we have to do all 3. First, we go with Hoshino to the ADDC and blackmail Kido. It doesn't work because he'll be killed if he testifies. Yagami vows to get him to testify. We then head with Kaito and Higashi to stop the leftovers of the Matsugane family. Kengo wants vengeance for Matsugane and Yagami refuses to reveal the mole's identity. We have to fight the rest of the Matsugane family, including Kengo. It's kind of a rough battle because Kengo and Ozaki are involved. Ozaki fights the same way as always, big and lumbering huge attacks. These aren't too bad alone, but when he has a group behind him, it's difficult to avoid. Kengo also has a sword and can chime in from time to time by taking out half of our health bar. After we defeat them, Yagami tells them all about AD9 and Kuroiwa. He tells them that he'll get their revenge in court, but if they seek out Kuroiwa, they'll just get killed. Finally, Yagami and Sugiura head to the detention center to visit Okubo. He asks Yagami to relay a message, that he wants to visit Emi's grave with him someday. He's relieved that Terasawa's family doesn't hate him anymore. Yagami swears that he's going to save him. Yagami is asked to head over to the Genda law office where Kaito and Hoshino are. Genda and Izumida are there as well. Izumida has gotten Ichinose to testify at the trial. Mafuyu lets us know that Morita is having the police raid Ayabe's casino. This is probably to try and tarnish Ayabe's reputation and make him look bad at the trial. Kaito and Yagami head over to try and find Kuroiwa. Morita stops them and tells them all about Ayabe and his bad name. Yagami confronts him with the information about his mother. Morita explains that he chose to help them out despite the murders and corruption because of the promise of the drug. Yagami chimes in with some choice words here. Fire tempers iron and temptation steals the just. Yagami says that Morita chose to help AD9 despite everything, and his guilt means nothing. He's just as responsible for the death of Emi and Okubo being in prison. Morita snaps when Yagami brings up his brother. Kuroiwa steps in, and we finally go toe-to-toe with the man. It's a pretty hard fight. He has 4 health bars and does a ton of damage. He also has the special ability to jump attack off of walls, which can be punishing. Utilizing X actions, though, can help us out greatly here. After he's defeated, he pulls a gun on Yagami. Morita stops him from killing them, and they leave. The Matsugane family is outside, trying to find the two. They are calmed down, and Hoshino is found to have been behind it. He called them because he was worried about Yagami and Kaito. Yagami scans the crowd and sees the man in the black raincoat. The two chase him through the city, eventually to a rooftop, and demand his identity. The man removes his hood, but before we can see his face, we jump ahead 1 month. Yagami has his lawyer Diggs on again, the morning of Ayabe's trial. Hattori has released an article about the AD9 conspiracy with pictures from the video Sugiura took of the lab. Yagami heads to the trial. Ichinose takes the stand and Yagami lays everything out. The whole conspiracy and eventually gets to the framing of Okubo. Ichinose wants evidence and Yagami has it. We jump back a month ago to the roof and the man reveals himself to be Hamada. He regretted not being able to attend Matsugane's funeral. Hamada decides to settle his debt with Matsugane since he's gone. Every conversation with Ichinose has been recorded on his phone. We jump ahead again to present day, and Yagami plays the recording for the court. Ichinose is berating Hamada for having Shintani call Shono. He tells him to have Kuroiwa deal with him. Ichinose says it's doctored audio, but Yagami brings in Hamada himself to testify. Kido is testifying as well, believing that Yagami will win the case and wants to be on the winning side. Morita is being arrested for corruption right this moment. Ishimatsu leaves, sensing the tides turning. Kaito, Higashi, and Sugiura all run after him. Ichinose won't tell Yagami what he's doing, so Yagami heads with them, leaving Hoshino to take the case on his own. He's nervous at first, but once he gets a smile from Sayori, he's ready to go. Kaito has subdued Ishimatsu, who says that Ichinose has put a hit out on Kuroiwa. They have to get to him before he's killed because their case relies on him. They don't know where to find him, but Mafuyu calls and tells him that there was a shooting in Theater Square. We fight our way through tons of goons on the way and eventually find a mess of thugs shot dead in the streets. One thug is still left breathing, and he tells Yagami that Kuroiwa is headed to the ADDC to kill Shono. They need Shono to confess to be able to free Okubo. Mafuyu calls the cops to send them to the ADDC. Once there, it begins raining and the cops are confused, ordered by Kuroiwa to kill the group. We have to fight through a bunch of security guards. Kaito and Higashi hold some back so Sugiura and Yagami can chase down Kuroiwa. He's killing anyone that gets in his way, and as they walk across the walkway, Kuroiwa shoots a gas tank, causing it to explode. The two are ejected into the street and they enter in through the garage. As we're walking, Yagami starts to have visions of Okubo finding Waku's body, of Shintani and him visiting the hospital, and finally of Emi talking to him that day. She begs him to help Okubo.
Please, Yagami-san. You need to help Okubo-kun. And my brother, too. He's stubborn, but he means well.
And finally, it fades. Sugiura admits that he heard Emi's voice as well. They find Kuroiwa pointing a gun to Shono's head, and he kills more cops in the process. Sugiura was shot in the stomach, and Yagami tells Shono to make sure he lives. Kuroiwa explains that he rushed to the facility to force Shono to finish the drug so they could go out like heroes. Yagami thinks he's insane, and we have our final boss battle. Kuroiwa fights pretty similarly to the first time, big, heavy attacks and a lot of mortal wounds. As long as we heal and keep our distance from his big attacks, we can get in our own big damage when there's an opening. During the fight, Yagami is almost thrown from one of the windows and swings around. The whole thing takes place in this huge open room, glass windows surrounding us, the rain falling heavy outside, shattered glass littering the floor. It's an amazing set piece and is probably one of my favorite final boss battles in the Yakuza series from an aesthetic and story perspective. After we drain Kuroiwa's health bar, he injects himself and we have to fight him again. Finally, we defeat him, and Higashi and Kaito arrive with the cops. Shono heads over and Kuroiwa tries to stab him, but Kaito prevents this. The cops shoot him and Kuroiwa says the experiments are over. Shono pulls out a syringe, explaining that this is a perfected version of AD9, the final version. Sugiura has been recording the whole thing. He gets Shono to confess the whole thing on camera. Meanwhile, Kido is testifying at Ayabe's trial. He reveals that Shono told him it was impossible to remove the toxins from AD9. It was a waste of time, money, and life. Shono says everything he did was for this and rejects Yagami's spats of insult. He injects himself, finally trying to prove the drug worked, but it didn't. He begins to seize and dies. Kido explains at the trial that the main symptom of the poison is that the eyes turn a bright, unnatural blue, which is why the mole had to gouge out their eyes. We jump ahead to 10 days later. Yagami is visiting Okubo, who has cleaned up. The retrial starts next week, but he's sure to win the case. It's open and shut. Yagami leaves and shows Okubo that he brought a guest, Sugiura. Shono and Kuroiwa are dead, Morita and Ichinose are in jail, and the ADDC is shutting down. It's a bittersweet win because Kajihara still wins in the end, able to develop on the land, but Kajihara is also being investigated now. Hoshino and Sayori are now openly dating. Back at the office, Kaito and Mafuyu are telling Yagami it's okay if he wants to become a lawyer again, but he doesn't want to, because lawyers prove innocence, and he wants to find the truth. Kaito gets a call at the office to find a lost cat, and Yagami is ready and excited to help. The end credits play as Kaito and Yagami bro out while trying to get the found cat to stay in the office. Judgment's story overall is fantastic. It's not a complete shift and change from the other Yakuza games. It's not like this game is miles different from every game in the series, but its tone and scale is entirely new for the series. The story feels smaller, even though we're taking down a grand conspiracy in the medical industry and trying to find a serial killer. It still feels like a much more focused version of what the Yakuza games before it have done. It also just has an entirely different tone. It feels a lot more dark. This detective theme lends itself to the atmosphere of the city. Solving murders, trying to catch criminals, tracking down leads. These are things we've always done in Yakuza games, but they've always been in the context of the Yakuza. In Judgment, the Yakuza exist, but they're more of a background character than anything else. The whole thing doesn't rest on the fate of the Tojo or the Omi. Judgment is about people, about experiences, motivations. I feel like RGG really shines when they're able to leave the bounds of the Yakuza and try something new. Judgment almost feels like another risk in their story, a chance to break off the chains and step out into something else, and it worked very well. Just because there was a change in character and theme for Judgment doesn't mean that the classic side content that we know and love has changed, though. Judgment still has a whole host of distractions for us to get caught up in. Judgment has two larger minigames that I'd like to talk about first. The first of those is Paradise VR. Throughout the game, we'll eventually unlock this in the main story. This is a VR game that we can play in Kamurocho. We have to hand over play passes and select a course, and once we do, we can put on a VR headset. When we're in the VR world, it basically functions like a board game. We roll a die to see how many spaces we move, and we can then choose which paths we'd like to take on the board. Spaces can be anything from a safe that gives us items, a person that gives us items, enemies that we have to defeat, losing or gaining dice. We have a certain amount of die at the beginning of the course, and if we don't make it to the end before we run out, then it's over. All of the items we collect can be exchanged for real money though, so this is a good way to get cash if Yagami is short. The game gets a little more complex during the middle and longer versions of the courses though. This will see monsters appearing on the board that will threaten to steal all of our items. The second large minigame that Judgment holds is the drone racing. This is a pretty simple racer where we can fly drones around tracks in Kamurocho. It's quite a lot like the Dragon Kart racer from Yakuza 7, except that there's some more depth and customization, and it also includes the verticality, moving up and down. It's not bad, but I wasn't rushing to play this one very much. It was just something to complete. Throughout the story, we'll eventually be told about an app called Quickstarter. This is something we can access from our phone that basically functions as Kickstarter, if you couldn't tell. Projects will go up here that we can choose to fund. These projects will then give us rewards at our mailbox. These can be incredibly useful, like Dyson Cube strategy guides that unlock challenge courses for Paradise VR, or new dart sets for us to throw. If we want to unlock more skills to power Yagami up and make him stronger, we can find all manner of skill books around the city. We can also scan some 2D codes that appear in the world. These will generally be on different posters, and taking a picture of them will allow us to unlock the skill or drone part associated with it. Something that comes up a lot throughout the story and in Premium Adventure is the Kaihan Gang. The Kaihan Gang will terrorize the city pretty often. You'll get a text from a local saying that their leaders have shown up in Kamurocho, and it's best if we go stop them. Their threat level will be displayed on the screen, and the only way to get it down is to wait or defeat their leaders. These are little bosses that pop up around the city. Every time we defeat the leaders, we get a small reward. There's an old man in town who will teach us how to prepare extracts. These are little potions that we can drink and will give us a boost in battle. I didn't use these too much as I found I didn't really need them on the normal difficulty of the game, but the DLC includes a couple extracts that are insane, even one that instant kills all enemies in the battle. Throughout our adventure, in side cases, we'll eventually get to know some women. Yagami can get a girlfriend if he chooses and take her out on dates to gain her affection. Arcade games also return with some new additions, specifically a really interesting one, Kamuro of the Dead. This is clearly a play on games like House of the Dead and is an on-the-rails shooter. It's also a huge reference to the Yakuza Dead Souls game. It's actually a really fun shooter that I had a ton of fun playing, and is a great addition to the Yakuza arcade games. We also have the classic gambling, batting cages, darts, and the addition of the new capsule machines, which really gave me Shenmue flashbacks. One big void from this entry, though, is the huge, gaping space where karaoke once was. But of course, as usual, the meat of Judgment's side content is in that of sub-stories, but Judgment doesn't call them sub-stories, it calls them side cases and friends. There are two types of sub-stories in this entry. The first I want to talk about is friends. These aren't really sub-stories fully, but they're a form of them. Certain people around the city can become our friends if we interact with them enough. These can go from really short interactions, like spending a certain amount of time at the Papo store, or really long ones, like returning to a business 6 times to give the owner our advice on how to make more money. Each time we talk to the person, we have to wait a bit before we talk to them again, so not all of this happens at once. Once they become our friend, that increases our city reputation, which can get us more jobs. There are 50 total friends in the game, so there's a lot of reputation to be gained. I like the system quite a bit. Friends will even walk around town and you can meet them in the streets, they can help you out in battles, and give you items when you return to them. It creates a city that feels like it knows you. The more time you spend there, the more support you have in your adventures. But of course, the larger sub-stories are relegated to side cases. These can also be shorter, but most of them are longer stories and are closer to the sub-stories that we know from a classic Yakuza game. One of my favorites was Amidst a Dream. This begins when we find Sana singing in Theater Square. She's trying to become a famous singer and we buy her CD. She eventually says that she got a deal from a producer, but we find out that he's pretty shady and wants Sana to do some unprofessional things. She ends up getting kidnapped and we have to track her down and save her. After this, she can become Yagami's girlfriend. Another great one starts when we get a job from Tender. We have to dress up as a superstar to distract his fans before a performance. This superstar happens to wear a pretty abrasive vampire costume. We eventually get cornered and have to answer questions for the media. Apparently the superstar has done some terrible things, and we end up saying that he'll do community service to make up for it, forcing the guy to atone for his actions. Another great side case starts when we get barked into a bar in the Champion District. The drinks are supposed to be 2,000 yen, but the woman gives us our bill for 100,000 yen. It's all a big scam and we're forced to pay up. Yagami deduces that she might be cheating on her husband though, and we tail her to find out. We get a picture of her cheating with an expensive host and blackmail her to get our money back. The lady is just so dramatic throughout the whole thing, and it really makes this side case hilarious. There's plenty of other great ones that I won't talk about here, but the side cases in this game are fantastic. They feel really fleshed out, and when we put them up against the sub-stories in the Yakuza series as a whole, they really stand out. I feel like the case structure and menu also work so well for these side cases, adding a whole new element to these short tales. The side content overall in Judgment isn't the greatest in the series. It isn't packed full of extra stuff to do, just some fun things here and there. I think I can forgive it though, due to the fact that this was the team's first foray into the detective theme, so it makes sense that they'd focus more on the new gameplay elements than the side content. Overall, I think Judgment does exactly what it was trying to do. It's a new venture into a different version of this world that we already know so well. We're seeing a new side of things. We have a whole new cast of interesting characters to get to know and care about. The combat is top-notch and is honestly some of the best in the series. The story itself is well done, and the mystery and intrigue surrounding it constantly keeps you guessing. The new systems also do a lot to feed into the detective work that you're doing in your head to figure out where the story is going next. The game also looks beautiful. The Dragon Engine, and especially the remaster, makes these characters in Kamurocho look stunning. If you have played Yakuza and haven't checked out Judgment, I would highly recommend it. I would also recommend it to the people who haven't played the games before. It can be a great starting point for the series overall, as these games don't connect to the overall Yakuza story. Judgment was given positive reviews by critics and praised its gameplay. Some did have problems with the tailing missions and detective elements, saying that they were frustrating. The game did very well in sales, exceeding expectations, especially in the West. RGG and Sega would eventually greenlight a sequel, but we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.